feedback. Thank you to Lisa and Shannon for setting this up. We are recording this Zoom for those of you that want to view it later in your sales meetings, in your offices, and for those that could not make it today. Thank you again for such short notice. It is a very exciting week in our industry. Monumental changes are near. You all should have received our pay attention memo last week that we sent out that addressed a lot of the questions. But because so many of you are auditory learners and maybe didn't read the whole memo, we thought that we would get on Zoom and talk about some of the questions. If you have any questions while we're speaking today, please use the chat and we will try to respond to all of those. And I have a few helpers with me today so that Chad doesn't have to be the talking head for the next hour. I think that's it for housekeeping items. We'll go ahead and get into the meat of our conversation. And first up, we are going to talk about the removal of the compensation fields and get a very brief update from the MLS side of everything that's going on. And so Jessica Reinhardt, we're very lucky to have on our management team. Jessica manages RE/MAX Alliance's Parker branch, very involved in DMAR, and she is currently on the board at RE Colorado. So Jessica, if you could talk about RE Colorado briefly, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm probably not going to tell you anything you don't already know, but my main point here is that the co-op is leaving RE Colorado on the 15th. Jesse can speak to Iris, but in general, it's leaving on the 15th. And the main message I have for you guys is don't try to put your co-op, if you have one, into RE Colorado. So they've built an algorithm. They're currently looking for like 87 words. And if you are caught putting a co-op commission into RE Colorado, they're going to fine you. So your first one will be a warning. Your second one will be a $250 fee. Then it goes to $500. Then it goes to $1,500. And if you've done it for a fifth time, they're going to remove you from RE Colorado. So the moral of the story is don't do it. Just please don't try to put your co-op into RE Colorado. That's kind of it for me.
All right. Thank you, Jessica. And thank you to RE Colorado. Jesse Engel, our rock star from Northern Colorado. Jesse has been making the rounds teaching some excellent contract classes. I heard from some folks that attended his class at DMAR. In comparison to some of the legal experts, Scott Peterson and Damien, some high fives to Jesse saying his class was actually superior. We're really, really fortunate to have Jesse on our team as well. And I'm going to tee up Jesse to give an update from Iris. Jesse's also going to talk about the new Colorado real estate forms, the existing listing agreements, what we're doing with current contracts, and then he's going to touch on working with buyers post this coming Saturday, the 17th. So Jesse Engel, you are up, and thank you.
Thanks, Chad. You're making me blush over here, so appreciate that. So Iris has implemented similar policies. They are removing the offer compensation. What's a little bit different with Iris is that your first offense, if you're caught posting compensation, whether it's in the broker's remarks or the driving directions, or you're using any type of code speak, or if your listing ends, the price ends with a 3, that's a 3%, or price ends with 2, it's a 2%. Don't do any of those things. Their first offense in Iris is $1,500 for the very first offense. No warning. So please don't try to circumvent that rule. There's no need to do it anyway. If you've been to some of my classes, you understand that. The other thing that's a little bit unique about Iris is that when it comes to concessions, the settlement still allows for listing brokers to make offers of concessions in the MLS. But what Iris has said is that you cannot use a specific percentage or a specific amount of concessions. You can merely state things like the seller is open to negotiating concessions, or vague references to concessions. You can't use an actual number, can't use an actual percentage. So at least for the Iris users, please do not use solid numbers, solid percentages. If you're making reference to concessions, they'll fine you for that as well. I don't think they've developed a fine policy for that, but I don't think it's going to be 1,500 if it's concessions related, but we're still working on the details for Iris. As far as contracts go, you all know that there's a new contract to buy and sell, a new exclusive right to buy, a new exclusive right to sell, a new brokerage disclosure to buyer, and then there's a brokerage firm compensation agreement. I think Diana is probably on, and Diana will talk about the brokerage firm compensation agreement. What I do want to just clarify a little bit is that that form is a great form for buyers brokers. I have some hesitation on the listing side, but if there is going to be broker to broker compensation on either the listing side or the buyer side, Remax Alliance policy is that we have to absolutely use that form. We don't want you texting or emailing offers of compensation. That creates some issues that we don't have time for today. But please use the brokerage firm compensation agreement if there is broker to broker compensation. If there is no broker to broker compensation, that is inappropriate to use that form. Okay. The other thing that I'll mention is the Real Estate Commission just had another meeting with regards to a few extra forms that were also updated. One of those is the counter proposal, and one is the amend extend. That doesn't really change anything that has to do with what most of you practice. There was one change with regards to one deadline that's only found in the commercial contract. So doesn't affect most of you. If you see there's changes to those, don't freak out. Unless you're a commercial broker, and then it just changed an objection to a termination. That's all it did. The other form that they updated is the residential addendum. If you're familiar with residential addendum, that is a form that gets added to either the land contract or the commercial contract if there is a residential structure. And really what changed in the residential addendum is just conforming changes that also made change that changed in the contract to buy and sell. So again, nothing new as far as hopefully what you've already learned with regards to those forms. So don't freak out when you see that there's additional forms. We don't need additional classes. Nothing needs to be revised there. Chad, I don't have my agenda pulled up. What else did you have me talking about?
Jesse, if you could talk about our existing listing agreements.
Oh, sure. Okay. So one of the things that the settlement calls for is for, well, let's start with properties or buyers who are already under contract before August 15th. If they're already under contract, nothing at all needs to change. No disclosures need to be made. You're fine as long as that deal closes. If you have a seller or a buyer who you've signed an exclusive right to buy or an exclusive right to sell with, and they are not under contract by the 15th, what the settlement requires is that you provide a written disclosure that effectively just says, hey, buyer or seller, you understand that compensation is not set by law and it's fully negotiable. Our forms have half of that on there already, but the new forms have the full verbiage in there. And so that disclosure can be an email, it can be in an amendment, it can be in a new agreement, but it certainly doesn't have to be an amendment. It doesn't have to be a new agreement. Where you got to be careful is particularly on the seller side. If you are representing a seller who is not under contract and they want to change the way that you handle the offer of compensation moving forward, you do need to either have an amendment with that seller to change that offer of compensation and how you're going to negotiate that moving forward, or you need to do a new contract. Now, we can't force buyers or sellers to sign a new contract. And if they won't sign a new contract, or if they won't sign an amendment, then we're operating under the terms of the old agreement. So if you have questions on that process beyond the scope of what we can talk about on the call today, but I'm certainly happy to walk you through that. If you have buyers who are not under contract, if you have sellers who are not under contract, if you want to talk about how we ought to advise buyers and sellers moving forward, that's outside the scope of this call, but I will make myself available for that. I think the other thing, Chad, you mentioned maybe buyers, working with buyers moving forward. And so what I want you to know is that you're going to come across various different brokers on the listing side who are operating under different, what I'll call models. One of those models is broker to broker compensation. The other model is there is no broker to broker compensation. But just because there is no broker to broker compensation does not necessarily mean that seller won't consider an offer of compensation. And so what I would tell you is you're going to have that agreement with your buyer moving forward. And you're going to have an agreement in place with them that memorializes the amount of compensation that they are obligated to pay you. You're going to then ask for the seller, or you can ask the listing broker to make that offer of compensation, even if they tell you that it's nothing, because everything is negotiable. And so if you've ever negotiated concessions that weren't publicly posted in the MLS, if you've ever negotiated a price that was lower than what the listing price was in the MLS, then you should understand this concept as well, that you can also go in there and negotiate your compensation even when there is no offer of compensation. And so don't let that hold you up. Don't be the roadblock for your buyers who want to pursue that property. Now, if after you're unable if after you try to negotiate compensation and you're unable to do that, then you as the broker do have the ability to force that buyer to pursue different properties if that's what you choose to do. You can take a lesser amount if that's what you choose to do. If you take a lesser amount, you do not need to amend your agreement with your buyer. That's fine. You can just do that. Or you can choose to work for free. I don't think most of us do this for charitable causes. There's E&O stuff that we need to be worried about. And so I don't recommend doing that. But don't be the roadblock for your buyer if there's a house that they want to see just because it says, hey, there is no offer of compensation. Go negotiate it with the contract.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jesse. For those of you who have never taken a contracts class from Jesse, please make a point to. He will be publishing some additional events coming into the fall. We're just very fortunate to have all of our wonderful managing brokers and volunteers at the MLS and association level. So really appreciate it. Next up is going to be Diana Mendez. Diana Mendez is RE/MAX Alliance's attorney. She has been working with our firm for a number of years. We've had a great relationship with Diana and her peers. I'm asking Diana to talk about the compensation requirements, document the use of the compensation agreements, and she's going to talk about buyer agreements before showings and Alliance's policy on those items. So Diana, welcome. Thank you for your short notice in joining us today. I also see that we have a message from Tori. Has there been a formal approval or change with VA buyers? We can talk about that as well. So forthcoming. Diana, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Chad, and good afternoon, everyone. So today, obviously, the big ticket item is when you're working with a buyer, how are we going to make sure we get paid? So no longer can we just rely on the cooperative commission offering in the MLS to make sure that you're getting paid. So there are extra steps that need to be taken. Now, in the exclusive right to buy listing contract, there is an option that you can check a box that says that the buyer is going to pay your commission no matter what. That might be the simplest way to do it, although it might not be the preferred method for your buyer. So if you do check that box that says buyer must pay, then you don't have to worry about the next of these instructions. But what most of us are probably going to check, or what we foresee happening more, is checking the box at 7.3.1 that says that the seller or seller's broker may pay, buyer is obligated to pay. And that works a little bit differently than it has in the past. So in order to make sure that you can secure the full amount of your compensation that you've set forth in the exclusive right to buy listing contract, you need to do a couple of things. Number one, as Jesse was saying, you need to figure out in negotiations with the seller's broker whether the seller broker is going to offer any compensation or whether the seller is going to offer any compensation to you as the buyer broker. Once you determine that, and the seller broker says, sure, I'm offering 2% compensation on this property, and you know that it's coming from either seller or seller broker, you can determine how you are going to fill out your offer and how you're going to advise your client. In this scenario, if you have a 2.5% compensation in your buyer agency agreement and the seller or seller's agent is only going to offer 2%, the new buyer listing contract indicates that you cannot charge your buyer the extra 0.5% if you do not advise that buyer in writing before submitting the contract on their behalf of the deficiency that they're going to be required to pay. So it's really important every time that you're going in to write a contract on behalf of your client that you discuss with them what's being offered, by whom it's being offered, and what the deficiency balance that the buyer is going to be expected to pay is. If you don't advise your buyer with each contract what that deficiency is, you're not going to be able to recover it. It's automatically going to go away, and you're going to be limited to what's being offered by the seller or the seller's broker. It's also important to understand whether the compensation to the buyer's agent is going to be provided by either the seller or the seller's agent, because you'll see in the contract to buy and sell real estate, you have three different options. You have an option that says that the amount is going to be paid by the seller. That's option 1, 29.1. You have an option that says at 29.2 that the compensation is going to be paid by the buyer. And then you have a third option that says that the compensation is going to be paid by the seller broker. These all are a little bit different. In the first case, where the seller is going to be paying the compensation and you click 29.1, then the contract, the broker becomes an intended, or the brokerage firm on behalf of the broker becomes an intended beneficiary of the contract, and you have a binding agreement with that seller because the seller is a party to the contract to buy and sell real estate. And number 2, if the buyer is going to pay, that should be as memorialized in your listing contract. So again, you have a binding agreement that shows what your buyer is supposed to pay you, and that should be consistent with what's in the contract to buy and sell real estate. In the event that you check number 3, the seller broker is going to pay some or all part of your commission, you do not have a binding agreement for that commission to be paid until you have the broker compensation agreement that's executed. And so the Colorado Bar Association has prepared a brokerage firm compensation agreement for use in these scenarios. And you guys can review it. I think it's pretty straightforward. The point is that without this document, even if 29.3 is checked in the contract, you do not have a binding agreement to require that other brokerage firm to pay your commission until you have the compensation agreement. So that begs the question, when do we get it signed? How do we get it signed? And what's best practices? And some of us have heard that maybe listing agents are going to offer this prior to going under contract when offers are being made and compensation is being offered. And that way you can submit a signed brokerage firm compensation agreement with your offer. Because what we don't want to happen is that you click 29.3, seller agent's going to pay, you submit the offer with an unsigned compensation agreement, and then the broker never signs it, and you end up in a dispute as to whether or not there was an agreement to pay that commission. So best practices, if you can get it before you submit the offer so that you can make the required disclosure to your buyer and you could submit it together with the offer already signed so you don't have that issue, that would be number 1. Best practice number 2 is that if you can't do that and that's not practical, you can always check the box in 29.1 that says the seller is going to pay this amount. And then when the listing broker can come back and say, let's extend the contract to actually indicate 29.3, and here's the signed brokerage firm compensation agreement. So all of this to say, there are some new practice changes in the way that you do and write offers and prepare offers and discuss these issues with selling brokers. And you have to make sure that at every contract, you are advising your buyer what they may or may not owe you based on what's being offered by the seller, agent, or broker, if anything. I see a question coming in. Based on telling the buyer how much they will owe, what if the listing agent does not respond to requests for information either from the listing broker or seller? Okay, so I think what Eric's asking, how do you tell the buyer what they're going to owe if you don't know what the seller is offering? I think that's how I sum up your question, right, Eric? Yeah. So in that case, what you tell the buyer is what the contract reflects. So if you click 29.1 and you say they're going to pay 2% and you have an agreement for 2%, then you tell the buyer you don't know anything. When they get the counter proposal back that maybe changes that, so with every step of this, you're going to have to be thinking about this, but if you get a counter proposal that comes back and it's different, then you would explain, this is what the counter proposal is. Before signing the contract, understand that this is the commission that's owed, this is what's being offered, this is the deficiency that you're going to have to make up. So yeah, good point. It might not necessarily just be at the time of writing the offer. It might be at the time of receiving and talking to your client about the counter proposal. Terry says if checking 29.2 for buyer, hold on, questions are coming in. If checking 29.2 for buyer to pay for the difference between your fee and what seller or listing brokerage is paying, does it satisfy the in writing requirement, or is it safer to also outline in a cover email? My recommendation is to outline it in a cover email and not just check 29.2. And Terry, thank you for that question, because it raises the point that we've haven't touched on here, is that it is appropriate. It may be appropriate to use more than one box, 29.1, 29.2, 29.3. They're not mutually exclusive. So my recommendation is outline it in a cover letter. And then Nadine says, can you check both? We just covered that. Yes, you can check one or more of how you're going to be compensated. Does the buyer agency agreement that identifies commission owed serve as the written notice to each contract submitted? No, it needs to be specific to each offer and in email and advise, you know, at the time you're sending over the offer for them to sign before submitting it to the seller, at each time you should be telling them what the difference is, because it might be different from offer to offer. Some might be offering no compensation. Some people might be offering, you know, more or less different. So that does not suffice. Does anybody else have any questions on how we're going to use these compensation agreements to make sure that we're compensated as buyers agents?
I have a question. Can I ask it like this or on chat?
Feel free to ask this way, Nadine.
Okay, so on the compensation agreement, so I went to Jesse's class yesterday. That was good. He explained a lot of stuff, but I need more. So that's why I'm here. So what I understand him saying multiple times is I don't need that if the seller is offering the commission.
Correct.
Like I called Jim Smith, he says, yeah, we're giving you 2.5. Do I write that down? What do I do if he says the seller is giving 2.5? I'm just going to check 29.1, 2.5, don't need a commission agreement.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
the commission agreement is broker to broker. So I would say that's kind of if you're accepting commission in a traditional model versus seller or from buyer.
Thank you, Diana. A couple more questions have come in. If you advised in writing when making the offer and then a counter offer changes it, do you need a second written notification?
Yes. Yeah. The whole point of all of this is transparency with your buyer in terms of what are they going to have to pay and who's paying what percentage. And so anytime something changes, you're going to need a new disclosure. And Jesse mentioned that if the compensation that you're going to accept is going to be less than what's in the listing contract, you don't necessarily have to have this written disclosure because you're automatically not able to recover more. But my suggestion is that with every offer, whether your commission is going up and down, up or down, you're having that conversation so that when you do go back and say, hey, this seller is actually offering 3% and you'd like to actually move it up and amend your listing contract so you can accept 3% on that, it's going to be kind of a routine part of making offers on properties to have this discussion about what compensation is being offered and how that's accepted by you. So, yep, I have to have that conversation every time. And then are you recommending that we push them across the table when an agent calls asking what the seller is paying? Amanda, what do you mean by that we push them across the table? Push what? I'm sorry.
The compensation agreement.
Yeah, so I was just saying, if you have a signed compensation agreement, let's use your example of 2.5, and a buyer's agent calls ahead of showing it, are you actually recommending that we push that across the table, or are you recommending, like, do you want us to send that to buyer's agents in advance? If they're calling and asking, do you want us to send it?
If someone is going to make an offer and the listing agent is willing to provide a compensation agreement, then I don't see any problem with that. So I don't know, Chad, if you want to make a company position on this issue, but you know, if a buyer is calling to find out what's the compensation, we're writing an offer, then you can provide, you know, compensation agreement for in anticipation of that offer so that, you know, so that everybody knows that everyone's in agreement. Yeah. I think some brokers have indicated that that's going to be their practice. And so whether that's your practice or not, I don't think Remax Alliance is going to require you to do it one way or another, but it's certainly a way that you can handle this so that instead of receiving the contract and maybe having to then submit a counter proposal, you know, in order to then indicate that you're going to be paying the commission, you know, that might be one way to do it and, you know, eliminate the step of having to go through the counter proposal if the broker on the other side is being cautious and submitting it with 29.1 instead of 29.3. So I
Hello,
think
Chad.
that'll be a broker to broker decision, depending on, you know, what broker you're dealing with, how that conversation went. It might be on a case by case basis that you make a decision on how to proceed.
Hello, Chad. This is Jace. Could I ask a question?
Yes, please.
All right. Jesse Engel's class yesterday was phenomenal. And Jesse, I would like for you to weigh in on this, because what I'm hearing right now is flying a little bit in the face of what we talked about yesterday about the old system versus the new system. And if we're all going to be picking up the phone and trying to call and get someone to tell us what corporation, that's the old system. The new system, it seems to me, and Jesse weigh in, is that my seller, I work with a lot of listings, and they're going to offer 0, and they're going to put in there all offers of concession or compensation or whatever you want to call it will be considered. Is this going to be a negotiable? And so wasting a lot of time trying to call 10 people before a showing is nothing more than the old system in my mind. Jesse, would you weigh in on this?
Yeah, so let me tell everybody what I taught in class yesterday. So first and foremost, it's certainly acceptable under the terms of the settlement for there to be broker to broker compensation, right? It's not prohibited. What I'll tell you is, you know, imagine a situation where I call Jace and I say, hey, Jace, is your seller, you know, or are you as the listing broker making an offer of compensation, and you're not returning your phone calls, you're not getting those emails back to me, whatever the delay is. Right? Does it make sense to delay the presentation of my buyer's offer? And the answer is just get it submitted, check the 29.1 box, because at the end of the day, I'm going to be asking you, Jace, for the amount that my buyer is obligated to pay me. And then I think the other piece that Jace is speaking to is if we look at really one of the key terms of the settlement, one of the key terms is that sellers believed that this practice of making a unilateral offer of compensation up front and predetermining what every single buyer's broker across the board ought to be worth in a transaction was a practice that potentially harmed sellers, because what if that buyer's broker was only going to negotiate 1% with their buyer, but then when they called me and said, hey, is there an offer of compensation? And I said 3. Well, I may have left 2% on the table with my seller. Now, the other side of that, of course, is that there's not everybody maybe understands that concept. And so the question you're going to have to talk to your seller about and come to an agreement with your seller is, hey, seller, if you're not going to allow me to make an offer of compensation, is there a possibility that that could limit your buyer pool? Because maybe those buyers say, hey, I don't want to see those properties unless there's a publicly advertised offer of compensation. And so your seller is going to have to weigh those risks. And what I'll tell you in my personal experience is that most sellers are looking at that going, I don't really want to leave money on the table. And I believe that by making a unilateral blanket offer of compensation has the potential to harm me as a seller. And so everything is negotiable. The price, the concessions, the compensation, put it in the offer. Let's see it with the offer. And so I think that that's a fine argument, and I tend to fall in that camp. But both of those things are perfectly reasonable, and both of those things are allowed under the terms of the settlement, to have broker-to-broker compensation and to have seller compensation directly. Have buyer compensation as another option.
Yeah, you need to give all the options to the seller. You can't just say
Exactly.
that this is one way, let's offer 0. You need to give them all the information and let them decide how they want to push forward. I mean, some might think,
Absolutely.
yeah, let's go ahead and offer 2.5 because I want more buyers over here and I don't really care. So go that route. If they want to roll the dice and do the 0 and say, hey, we can negotiate. Am I allowed to tell the buyer's agents that you're negotiable on that? Whatever. You have to give them all the information under this law,
Yep.
not just steer them one way. That's my opinion only. I'm not an attorney.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine.
That's wise.
Christine, I see a hand up from Christine. Hello.
Hello, sorry, I raised my hand. I was just trying to, but honestly, you guys just hit on most of that. So I just want to clarify, because I too took Jesse's class, and how I'm proceeding is when we're representing a buyer, we're marking 29.1, I believe, that we charge 3%, period. So whether that comes from, we're going to ask for it in the in the contract to buy. So we're going to be asking for that. I don't plan on making the phone call to every agent before submitting an offer. I just want to put it in the contract to buy. So hopefully that is correct, if I'm hearing that correctly. And then with the listing contract, I too will explain to the sellers their options, but I feel like it is in their best interest to have a 0%. And that way of what they're willing to pay, and it will all be negotiated within the contract that is offered. That's how I'm proceeding? Is that correct?
So some sellers may have a difference of opinion. And so what I'm telling you is there is no one size fits all answer. I have my own opinions as to, you know, one of the questions, for example, was, hey, does Alliance going to come out with a policy as far as how they prefer? Do we go the seller route of compensation, or do we go the broker to broker route of compensation? And Chad, correct me if I'm wrong, and Diana, it doesn't make sense to have a policy. They're all valid options under the terms of the settlement. You're going to have to discuss the pros and cons with your seller. I believe that I understand the pros and cons well enough to know how I'm going to run my business. Christine, I think that I lead in your camp as far as how I'm going to advise my sellers. But at the end of the day, if they have a difference of opinion and they want to make a public offer of compensation, I'm happy to do that just as well. But the other thing to keep in mind is I don't really care if your offer of compensation as the buyer's broker is 1% or 3% or 5%. If it's a good offer for my seller, I'm going to advocate that my seller take the offer and pay you your 1% or 3% or 5%, right? And so it allows the buyer's broker to negotiate their own value with their own client. And it allows the seller to consider their net best offer based on whatever that offer of compensation is. So, but all of those are all valid options under the settlement.
I just want to verify that, because Caitlin, my daughter partner, and I were in this conversation. And so my understanding is we can go down. So if I submit an offer for a buyer and I'm saying 3% is what I'd like to be paid from the seller, if they counter that and they come back at 2.5 and I have 3% written in my buyer's agreement with the buyer, I can go down without charging them that extra 0.5%, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Okay. And I also, when representing the seller, we say 0% on the co-op. They can choose whatever they want to accept according to an offer. Now, the one question we have on our listing contract that Jesse, we learned, I think in your class, was we have to put in that listing agreement when we are listing a property, the max amount. So if we end up representing the buy side and sell side, then if we put in 5% or whatever that agreed percentage is, and in additional provisions, we go down and we say, if the listing agent does not represent the buy side of this, or however the language would be, then the listing co-op or the listing fee is 3%. Is that correct?
So you're referring to a specific situation where the seller has said, I don't want to publicly advertise an offer of compensation, and therefore section 7.1.1.1 would be 0. And so what you just have to be careful of is if you expect to be paid more than just the one side compensation, you're going to have to pre-contemplate that in your listing agreement to say, hey, this is the amount that I expect if I have to work with an unrepresented buyer. I'm not going to offer anything to I'm not going to publicly advertise an offer of compensation, but if I was expecting 5, if I worked with an unrepresented buyer, and then the buyer is represented by someone else, my 5 goes to 3 or 2.5, whatever your number is, right? And so those are all valid options as far as the settlement goes. So don't want to get too much into the weeds as far as all of the options on this call. That's a contract class thing, right? But those are all perfectly valid options. So I'm happy to help in those situations with verbiage if we need to.
Thank you.
Just one quick question with regard to a comment that Diana made to clear this up. We may not know what that compensation is going to be. So we can't disclose that to our buyer prior. I would think that the disclosure to the buyer would be once we submit our offer, the seller accepts it, then there's no disclosure needed, right? That's what they signed. If the seller counters based on what I offered, then that is the time we have that conversation of saying, hey, here is now your disclosure. If you sign this the way it's drafted, you might owe me that extra 0.5.
Yeah,
Correct?
that's a valid point, but you might have a situation where there's a listing that you see on a private broker website that there is a 2.5% commission offering. And so instead of, requesting the seller pay 3%, you submit the contract with the 2.5 that's publicly being offered on the private website. And then you advise your buyer, they're only offering 2.5, and you're going to have to pay me the 0.5% difference. And so you make that disclosure. So yeah, it's not a one size fits all scenario, depending on what you're doing. If you are just, not calling, not figuring out what's being offered, and you're just negotiating into the contract for a full commission to be paid, then there is no disclosure that the buyer is going to have to pay a commission, a deficiency, because if the offer is accepted, then there's no disclosure because they don't have to pay anything. And if it's countered, then you make the disclosure at that time, because at that point, that, okay, there's a 0.5% deficiency here. Buyer, if you accept this counter proposal, this is what you're going to have to pay me at closing.
Thank you, Diana. There was an earlier question about VA, and our wonderful friends at Home Mortgage Advisors let me know that applications taken after August 10th, VA is allowing veterans to pay certain buyer broker charges when purchasing a home using their VA loan benefits. So hopefully that one helped. Amanda asked a question, a thought-provoking question. Perhaps the compromise is to wait 1 business week and see if the seller is able to get a bidding war before openly sharing a compensation agreement specifically addressed to Jace on this one. Thoughts on this, Diana and team?
The compromise to wait a business week, like if the listing is just sitting on the market and then you kind of find out, I think this all depends on what your buyer wants in that case, because your buyer waiting a week to see if the house might still be on the market, to see if they're going to share this information, I think is a decision your client makes, if I'm understanding you correctly.
I think the question is more like, if I have a hot listing, something that I really believe could end up in a multiple offer situation, is it in my seller's best interest to keep their potential offer of compensation that they may have given me in a listing agreement in my back pocket to play the first week out to make sure, because you have to figure if there's 5 offers, then the buyers are going to make an attempt to tighten their offer any way they can. So it wouldn't be in the seller's best interest to expose a potential offer of compensation in the first business week. And then if it lasts the weekend and it doesn't sell at my price, then the market's obviously rejected the price in that first week. At that point, you could start pushing a broker-to-broker compensation agreement out on the back end of a brokerage website or across the table when a showing shows up.
I think you would put 0 compensation in your listing agreement and then you would amend it in a week.
I don't know why you would ever put 0% for a cooperating broker.
Because you're not following, because if you're filling out a listing agreement that says you're supposed to pay 2.8, 2.5, whatever the number is, to the selling broker, but then you're holding it a week, it doesn't seem like that's very transparent to me.
Well, I think
Putting
transparency.
0. So that's
think
what I just want to ask, because I want to follow what's right.
Well, I mean, here's the Nadine, here's the pitfall I see for a listing agent. If you're a listing agent and you sit at a seller's table and you take a 3.2% listing commission and a 2.8% cooperating commission, and then a sign call comes in with a customer buyer, and you show the property to a customer buyer and you have 0, now you have agreed to do the entire transaction for 3.2%.
Well, I think that was
No, I wouldn't have that.
Yeah, I think that was to Jesse's point, that in that specific scenario, you need to make sure that you have some provisions that are covering you if you are going to be dealing with a customer and dealing with both sides.
Sure, that's a variable commission. So then
I think the point of this is that there's a lot of strategies that you can use to, navigate the situation differently. And at the end of the day, the reason Alliance can't have a policy on what we prefer or how things should go is because it's not the broker's decision to make. You can offer different strategies and different ideas, but ultimately your seller has to be comfortable with whatever strategy and whatever idea you're going to use. And they get to choose whether they want to openly offer compensation, whether they want to offer the wait and see approach, which is I'm not offering anything up front, but maybe if the house isn't hot and I can't get it sold without offering something, I will. And so you kind of have to allow the seller to dictate and educate the seller on what their different options are. And I think if you did have a listing agreement where the seller had committed to offer a cooperative compensation, and you can certainly not have to disclose that right up front, but if we're using that strategy in a way that was contrary to the seller's intentions of, I just want to get the house sold and I'm willing to pay the 2.5, and now we're not accepting offers because we're taking this wait and see. If that's not consistent with what the seller wants, then it's not how that should be played. So there are going to be all kinds of fun strategies we're going to see out there in terms of how this, actually plays out. And you'll have buyer agents that call you and ask what the compensation is going to be. And you'll have buyer agents that don't call you and submit the contract at, 29.1. There was a question that I just want to make sure we answer in terms of the difference between 29.1 and 29.3, because everybody's saying, it's really one and the same. 29.1 is when the money is coming from the seller at closing. So the seller is actually paying the compensation. 29.3 is the traditional model where the seller is paying the listing broker to share a commission with you. And so I understand how they could seem similar but different. So 29.1 directly from the seller, 29.3 broker to broker. The listing agent got a co-op to share with you, kind of like what we've seen historically.
Can I ask
Hopefully.
a question?
I'm sorry.
I want to ask just a question. Amanda, I'm curious, is that going back just a second, Amanda, is that going to be your strategy on like a hot listing, for example? Because I think that's an interesting and really neat approach. And the second part of that is for you, Diana. If we were to do, for example, a listing, great listing, and possibly withhold, would we be protected in that additional provisions of the listing agreement, in terms of marketing? Like, for example, like when I take a listing very early on, I'm putting in additional provisions. My marketing for this home will start on or before such and such. So I'm protected. Otherwise, I have to commence, I think within 3 days, right, of that signed listing agreement.
So you asked, the first question is what my practice is going to be.
Well, I'm just curious, are you going to suggest that strategy to your sellers? Because I thought it was actually very great. And I thought it was a really good idea.
I mean, I will tell you, if I'm being honest, I'm still contemplating all of this as well. I sell a lot of real estate. I want to represent the company well. I want to be fair. I want to be transparent.
Sure.
I don't totally have this worked out yet. So in all fairness to like this entire group and our brokerage and my friends in the business, like I don't have this worked out, but here's what I think I'm going to do. I think I'm going to sit down with the seller. I think I'm going to take this in what looks like a traditional listing arrangement. I don't believe I'm going to be asking my seller for a varied commission unless they push on it. So if I have a seller who wants to talk about a variable commission, if I bring the buyer or if somebody comes unrepresented, I will have that conversation really only if they are asking, because I think 9 of 10 sellers are going to be comfortable paying my service fee, my part of the listing commission. And I think they will be comfortable offering some commission over here. And really, I'm going to leave it on them to choose what amount they would like to pick. I'm not going to guide them necessarily on what amount to pick. And then from there, I think that I have like 3 checkboxes with the seller. Do you want me to disclose across the table immediately what you're willing to offer? Do you want me to hold it for a period of time? And what is that period of time? And then the third is, do you not want me to offer anything at any time, which is, fishing without bait, basically, which is fine. So they can decide at my listing table how much, when, and how they would like me to potentially behave once I take the listing. And so I think the 1 week hold is just a smart way to do it if something looks like it's going to be super hot.
And thank you for that. I appreciate it. And then Diana, the second part of that is that assuming there is a hold, for example, of maybe a week, let's just say, would we be covered
with the standard provisions that are in the exclusive right to sell listing contract? No, you would not be covered to take different approaches. But what I just heard Amanda say was that she's going to allow the seller to choose, and we'll probably have additional provisions in the listing contract that say, I'm offering 2.5% to buyers agents, but I do not want you to disclose this amount, and we will deal with it on a case-by-case basis as the contracts come in. And so you need that direction from your seller to be able to withhold any of this information, because otherwise the whole goal of the transparency and commissions is being thwarted by you trying to make a strategic decision without your seller's consent. So yeah, I think the second time Amanda explained that part of that process would be getting the seller's consent not to disclose the cooperative commission offering upfront.
Oh, so let's say Amanda, ring, ring. Hey, it's Nadine Kirk. Amanda, how you doing? I see
I'm
that you
fine.
just listed 123 Main Street. Man, that place is amazing. Are you guys paying the co-op at all?
I just want you to know, Nadine, that I respect you very much in this business. and that you and I have cooperated as brokers for a long time together. And I can tell you that I'm sitting down with my sellers and advising them that, you know, they have to figure out a way to sell their house for top dollar. I think you're just going to have, if my sellers have said, you're not allowed to tell them anything, then I'm
Right.
going to dance with you. I can
Okay.
only dance with you. The same way they might have said to me, I've got 10,000 in my back pocket for a roof, but I don't want you to tell them the roof's bad until they get the inspector up there. I'm not allowed. Well, in that case, I would have to disclose a deficiency, but okay, let's just say I'm going to dance with you, Nadine. I have
Okay.
to. I'm going to respect you. But if my seller has directed me that I'm
That's
not,
what I want. That's what I want. Yeah.
we're going to dance.
It's similar to whether or not your seller allows you to disclose the amount of competing offers, right? So the seller can either say, yes, you can disclose that, or no, you can't disclose that. So it's kind of a similar mechanism in that regard. So
Thank you for that.
Hey, Chad, real quick, can I just address one thing real quick? So what I'll say is, just because there is no publicly advertised offer of compensation does not mean that the seller is not willing to contribute to the buyer's broker. And so don't let that be the roadblock for you, because if you call me and my seller has said, hey, I don't want you to advertise it, but I might be willing to consider it with an offer. And you call me and I say, hey, my sellers have authorized me to not advertise a public offer of compensation. That doesn't mean don't go show the house. Still go show the house to your client. It's the right thing to do. If they want to pursue it, part of your value proposition is that your ability to negotiate. Come negotiate your commission in the contract with me. So I think brokers who have that perspective of, oh, there's no compensation being offered, and so it's not an option for my buyer, I think you're going to struggle with buyers moving forward to be able to get them into the homes that they really want, when I just think it's unnecessary. So you run your business how you want, but the other thing I'll just say is, with some of these unique ideas that you're coming up with as far as listing agreements, whatever you choose to do, make sure that you have it written in your listing agreement, what the strategy is going to be. Make sure that it's clear, because if it's not, that's where we get in trouble.
Thank you very much for that, Jesse. A couple other questions. I liked this one because there are some old timers. We were always taught never put the compensation in the body of the contract. Diana, you want to just touch on why that has changed?
yeah, obviously, given the changes with all of these settlements, the commission has made an effort to make sure that that's in the contract and has amended their commission approved forms to include that. So that is a relic of the past that no longer exists. And this is the manner in which the real estate commission has wanted to move forward. Something that's interesting about the broker compensation agreement that we actually have from the Colorado Bar Association instead of the Colorado Real Estate Commission is because the Colorado Real Estate Commission does not want to be involved in your commission disputes. And so the best way to still give you a mechanism to memorialize what your compensation is going to be was to just put it into the contract to buy and sell, but they did not want to be in charge of your compensation, broker to broker compensation agreement. So yep, that's a thing of the past, and this is the new way it's going to be handled. Obviously sanctioned by the commission.
Layla submitted a question. Layla, did you get the answer to your question?
I think we discussed that in terms of Amanda's wait and see approach, and that you would absolutely not be advised to do that if you did not have the seller's specific instruction not to share the cooperative commission.
Kayla, if you're withholding the commission co-op until a certain time, what are you telling buyer's agents as the co-op on the first week when they call? I think we also touched on that one.
I think so too. And my recommendation in that regard would just be to say, we may be willing to offer cooperative commissions, but I am not authorized to share what that looks like at this point.
Right?
Chad?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question on the flip side with new builders, because I noticed a lot of the new builders now are adding on every time you sell and close another of their home, your commission keeps going up. And so how do you negotiate that or deal with your buyer in that manner? I mean, do you just have to put the higher commission in there that you think you would get based on the second or third house you're going into the builder with that specific buyer? And are you negotiating that in your buyer agency? You're just putting that in your buyer agency agreement as what you think the highest amount of money you'll be receiving from that builder.
Chad, can I go ahead and jump in on that on the new construction side?
Please.
You're going to see a lot less of those kind of things, Joe, because the builders right now are very, very, very in tune to seeing this, and they're seeing an opportunity to potentially save on some commissions. So you're going to see less of those kind of stream ups and stuff like that. Now, some of them are working to just enhance the overall cooperative amount that they pay. So if they were willing to do that, they might give us a little bit of a boost. But most of the builders are going in the other direction. Some of them are getting so gallsy, if you will, that they're saying, well, we want to see what your buyer's agency says because we might be able to save money. Now, remember that buyer's agency is between the buyer broker and the buyer. When we start showing things, that's where we get the problem with Dora, and then we get to involve Diana and everything else. So I think you're going to see a little bit of calm back on that, Joe. They're still going to do it because they're also realizing right now there's a lot of chaos in the business. So I think we got to just focus on what we have in our hands, do the best we can, modify what we need to, but like Diana and Jesse have both preached, and I think we've talked about it a lot on here, is being transparent. So if we think it's good for the customer, that's great. But if we think we're doing something that's just good for us, we probably better rethink this and make sure we are really examining what we're doing. But builders are definitely morphing right now. There you go.
Thank you, Dennis. Back to some of the dates, a question: if we have an active seller's agency agreement in place and it's not under contract now, not under contract by the 15th, do we need to do anything different with our agency agreement?
So,
Covered
and
that.
we'll see if Jesse and I agree on this one. I heard a little bit in terms of you don't need to amend. Best practices is going to be to get that seller agency agreement on a new contract so that you have the ability to offer a broker to broker commission or a seller to buyer commission. I realize that you're not going to be able to accomplish that in every single case. So at the bare minimum, you need to email your seller and say, due to recent industry changes, I am required to advise you that buyer commission, brokerage firm compensation is negotiable and is not set by law. Absolutely have to do that. On the second thing is that you need to consider whether living under the old seller agency is going to change or have to be dealt with or amended if you get a contract that says something different than a broker to broker commission that you've agreed to in the old one. So if you get a contract that's under 29.1 and your seller decides that they want to go ahead and pay that, then you should probably go back and amend your listing contract so it indicates that you are only being paid one commission, has the new language that the seller can pay directly to the buyer, broker, and that kind of cuts off that cooperative commission that's no longer being offered. So if you are in a situation where you're working with an old seller agency agreement, you've made the email disclosure, and then you get a contract that your client wants to accept with 29.1 checked indicating that the seller is going to pay the commission, if you don't understand how to navigate that, you probably want to talk to your managing broker, because you want to think about how the current listing contract that you have is inconsistent with the contract you're about to close, and you want to clean that up. So
Diana,
Jesse?
Are you guys going to be, I understand the sentence, I can type it myself, to our sellers, for example, broker compensation is negotiable, put something in writing. Are you guys going to be sending out just a form sentence, like we all have to write it exactly this way?
It was in the
similar to our
memo.
Sorry?
It was in the pay attention memo that was sent out last week. So take a look at that again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Diana.
Chad, I have one other question. Going back to that 29.3 versus 29.1. You're working with the seller who's out of state. Wouldn't that be to your advantage to go to the 29.3 versus broker to, or a seller to broker or seller to buyer compensation? That's a good question for the attorney, maybe.
Yeah, I can see where that could become a problem, because if the seller doesn't pay you and then you have to deal with the lawsuit and out of town, then that
Absolutely.
that may be the best thing. However, those payments are going to be handled at closing in that case. If the seller has signed a contract under 29.1 that they owe you, it's going to be on their settlement sheet. And so you shouldn't have an issue.
All right.
Now, the lawyer says that and knows that there are always issues that arise, but sure, that may be something that you consider in terms of, how you talk to your buyer about what the best option is and why you prefer one mechanism over the other.
And there's still risk that a listing brokerage firm could fail to pay your compensation at closing. It's
And we
not.
deal with it every day. So yeah, there's risk everywhere. And so all things you can weigh and discuss with your clients in terms of how to fill these out.
Beverly has said she's having some struggles with it being ethical to hold information of what a seller is offering in compensation when the buyer's agent asks what they're offering.
Yeah, I think there's certainly an ethics issue with it unless or until your seller says, I'm willing to offer a cooperative commission, but I'm not willing to have you disclose that. I see it as akin to not being able to share what your competitive offers are in a multi-offer scenario. The seller gets to choose what information they're allowed to have. So,
Thank you.
you know, I see it the same.
Lynn, hello, Lynn. Should we put compensation in the contract before the new forms come into place? As we are already printing out the MLS.
Yeah, my recommendation in this regard was to get the broker compensation agreement signed. And if you look at the pay attention memo, there's also some recommended language in terms of saying, hey, since this is all changing, we just want to clean up the file. And can you please sign this to memorialize the cooperative commission that was previously offered in the MLS? So that would be my recommendation. Do you need it? Maybe not, but I think it's best practices and it's going to provide for the cleanest closing.
Tracy Phillips, if a broker is offering a co-op pay of X and your buyer agreement says you are paid Y, are you able to check both the first and the third option? I think we have covered that one.
Yes.
Check them all.
You can check them all if you want to. I don't know that I recommend it, but certainly you can use more than one.
Kathy has asked, can we not simply say that the seller is open to paying a commission to the buyer's agent depending on the offer?
Sure, if your seller's okay with that approach. That's kind of like saying it's negotiable. So again, if your seller's okay with that, there may be sellers who still want you to advertise an offer of compensation in a flyer, putting it in the home. There are other ways that you are still allowed to make that information publicly available. It's up to your seller to decide what they want.
Sorry, this is Lynn Westfall. I'm just wanting clarity. Are you saying that if we write contracts today, which I'm working on, we should be getting the compensation agreement that not sure I have access to, signed now, even if we print our MLS out? That has
printing the MLS is one step that you can take to avail yourself to that public offering. Yeah, my recommendation is that you start getting in the practice now of having the broker compensation agreement. And I do believe it's been put on SkySlope. You do have it available through Remix Alliance. And so if you have any questions where to find that, you can reach out.
And just note, there has been some questions about that agreement being branded to Alliance, and we are working behind the scenes on making that happen. But right now, it's very general form from the Bar Association. John has asked, if a home's listed for 500K and no buyer's co-op is offered, are we allowed to offer 510 and the 10,000 is then paid as compensation to the buyer agent?
Like put that in additional provisions in your offer. I don't know why you would do that if the buyer would just have to pay for it anyways. I guess I'm not understanding how offering 510 gets you. Are you saying additional provisions is going to say that you're going to get paid 10 grand?
Presumably that 10K would be able to be rolled into the loan. I would imagine that that's where this is coming from. Maybe it doesn't make sense for a cash buyer, but for a buyer who's getting a loan, obviously we have the appraisal to worry about. If it appraises, then yeah, put 510 and do the 10K, but you're still going to have to, for that 10,000, you got to make sure you're authorized to request it from your buyer first. And then you're going to have to figure out, is that going to come from the seller? Is it going to come from the broker? If it's coming from the broker, get the brokerage firm compensation agreement. If it's going to come from the seller, check the box in 29.1. Does that make sense, Diana?
Yeah, so they're kind of you're giving the seller the $10,000 to pay your broker fee, and so you check 29.1.
Yeah,
I think that's probably fine, and ultimately the concern becomes the appraisal, as Jesse noted.
A question from Chuck. At the end of the day, when we send a CBS asking for a commission from the seller, it is up to the seller to decide that's the deal they want, correct?
Yes, they can accept,
Yes.
counter, decline. Absolutely.
Kayla, hi Kayla. In the end, from a seller standpoint, what is the difference between 29.1 and 29.3? In the end, it is all coming out from their net proceeds. I get it is the listing brokerage versus seller paying it, but I don't think in the end the seller really cares.
I think that's probably true, and these might be one and the same. I don't know that there's a significant difference. It's ultimately all coming out of the seller's proceeds.
Alicia's asking, will you discuss what form we should have buyers sign prior to showing a home? That one was the topic.
Next item on the agenda.
Right.
So next item on the agenda was using a buyer agreement before showing. And there's been a lot of controversy over this topic because the Colorado Real Estate Commission, Marcia Waters, has said in Colorado, we are not requiring you to have a signed buyer agreement before showing properties. And so that has been the stance under Colorado law. And so RE/MAX Alliance is not taking a position that it is required. They are saying Colorado law does not require it. However, our MLS providers have created a new layer to this, and we don't know what each MLS is going to do. And so if you are a member of an MLS that requires a written agreement with a buyer prior to showing a property, then you do need to have that, and you do need to follow those MLS rules. So I think IRIS has come out with guidance indicating that they are going to require written buyer agreements prior to touring properties, which means that you have to either have an exclusive right to buy listing contract, or you can have a completed brokerage disclosure of relationships that has the new compensation form on it. Either of those would suffice. Other MLSs may not require a written agreement, and so it'll be up to you to navigate and understand what MLSs you're a part of and whether or not you need to have an agreement. Obviously, as we've discussed at length today, you cannot get paid without a written agreement. And so best practices is to have one, but it's not something that Alliance is going to require because it's not consistent with Colorado law. One big asterisk to put on this topic: if the Colorado Real Estate Commission catches you telling buyers that they have to sign an agreement because it's required under Colorado law, you are going to get in trouble. And so you need to be very careful when you're having these conversations with buyers, if you're a member of IRIS, to just say that the reason they need this to be signed is because your MLS provider requires it before you can show, because we do not want you to get in a situation where the Real Estate Commission believes you're extorting buyers to sign something under the guise of a Colorado law that does not exist. So that's something to be mindful of.
Thank you for that.
Chad,
Chad, can she cover open houses with that same situation? Does every individual coming in to see an open house and you're talking to need that disclosure signed?
No, there is a carve out in terms of open houses, so you do not have to have that. This is touring agreements, and I believe even IRIS, and I haven't had a chance to look at the new rules, and maybe Jesse can speak to IRIS, but I think IRIS has a carve out in terms of hosting an open house. It's not required.
Yeah, hosting open houses is fine. If you're the listing broker and they call on your sign or they call from your website and they want to go see the house, you do not need to have a written agreement with them because you owe those duties to the seller already. The other caveat that I would say specifically for RE Colorado buyers to understand, or brokers to understand, is that Colorado Real Estate Commission rules do require you to disclose your brokerage relationship with a consumer before eliciting confidential information from the consumer. And in reality, in practice, that's probably going to happen at your first meeting anyway. And so to the extent that you don't have a written agreement with the buyer at your first, as soon as you start to discuss that stuff, you would be in violation of Real Estate Commission rules, regardless of what your MLS may or may not require. And where I see some issues there is that then people will say, okay, well, I'll use the brokerage disclosure to buyer to disclose my brokerage relationship, not lock them into something. We don't put anything in the compensation agreement. I go show them houses. But the problem with doing that is that when you provide that to the buyer, you become a transaction broker by default for the buyer. And at that point, you owe them the uniform duties of a transaction broker. And if you have not secured your compensation in that agreement, then you've almost cemented the possibility that you might be working for free. So Diana, do you have any that did I misunderstand or just want to make sure
No,
that's
I
clear?
can agree with that, but just because you provide the broker disclosure definition of working relationship, as you noted, does not mean that you entered into an agreement for your compensation. So exactly, you might end up in a situation where you've presented that and you actually, don't have a mechanism by which to accept compensation. But I would also note that under Colorado law, if your buyer client doesn't want to sign that form, you're allowed to just put it in the file, submit it to client on this date in person, refuse to sign and put it away. And so you really wouldn't have a written agreement. So there is a way to comply with Colorado law with a buyer who doesn't want to sign an agreement and still show them a property, but that might not actually comply with IRIS and other MLS rules. And so I just there was 2 questions on here. I'll get back to the MLS issue. The 29.3 broker compensation agreement is only required if you're doing a broker to broker. 29.3, in terms of what we were talking about before, if you're operating under the traditional model where you're taking a cooperative compensation based on the MLS, I think best practices would be to get that signed since those fields are going away. Hopefully that clarifies. And then this is the caveat that you're going to end up in. What if the property is in more than one MLS? It's an RE Colorado and it's also an IRIS. And at the end of the day, you are bound by those MLS rules. And so if you are members, if every one of you is a member of RE Colorado and of IRIS, then you need to be following IRIS rules because they set the stricter standard. And you are going to be, governed by their rules. So if you are not an IRIS member and you're an RE Colorado broker, then there would be no mechanism by which you could be disciplined by IRIS. I don't know what Pikes Peak is doing. I don't know if anybody else has any sense. So far, the only one that we've had new rules from is IRIS, who has made it very clear that that's going to be a requirement. And does state law trump the MLS rules? Absolutely, but you are a voluntary participant to the MLS. And so they can't take away your license, but they can take away your access. And so you're agreeing to comply with their rules. And if you're listening to another MLS, beware the rules is a great point, Heather.
Chad?
Yes, Steve.
Question. MLS is trying to impose requirements on us that they really can't follow through with in terms of they'll never see any of the documentation, but they're imposing rules on us. Do we have, and given that the MLSs have not established completely their position on all this, do we have a seat at the table?
Well, IRIS has established their position on this, and I think that you have some RE/MAX Alliance members that are sitting on boards for some of these realtor associations, and so to some extent, that's your seat at the table.
Well, the associations own the MLSs, but the board on IRIS is what I'm talking about. Do we have anybody on that? Dennis, do you know?
Jesse, do you know?
Dennis is muted. There are no RE/MAX Alliance brokers on the board, managers for IRIS. But you mentioned one thing, Steve, that they can't enforce it. They can enforce it. It might be difficult for them to track this stuff down, but to the extent that they ask you to provide proof and you're not able to provide proof or you're unwilling to provide proof, then you're going to be subject to discipline from the MLS. They can eventually take away your MLS access.
But that's reactive, not proactive. They won't
Correct.
Proactively ask you for your documents.
That's correct. It would be a reactive process as opposed to proactive. They're not requiring us to turn in our exclusive right to buy with our clients. Correct.
Okay, one last item that I will touch on, displaying co-ops, and then we'll get back to the Loveland question. Displaying your compensation on Alliance websites. Per the settlement rules, we are allowed to display on your own personal website and the brokerage website, which is Homes in Colorado. We have been working with our vendor, and we will have instructions on Thursday from, thank you, Shannon, on how to do this if you choose. Obviously, today we talked about some strategies, some pros and some cons. And the message to all of you is this is at the direction of your sellers. This is their choice and they decide and they're going to tell you. We suggest that if they do want you to advertise on your own website or Homes in Colorado, that you get some sort of acknowledgement from the seller. Hey, we talked about the options. You're instructing me to do this. This is the amount we're putting on the website. Understand KV Core websites at this time do not have that ability. So your KV Core websites, you will not have the ability to display the compensation on your particular listing. Homes in Colorado and your Homes in Colorado powered websites, you will starting on Thursday. Let's see here, a couple of additional questions. From the Loveland office, for contracts to buy that are in place prior to Thursday, and we're unable to secure a signed broker commission agreement, would an email to the agent and the title company with the MLS fact sheet printed prior to August 15th be better to protect our commissions, or does the MLS cover us 100%?
The MLS should cover you, but I love the idea of an email, and I highly recommend that if you can't get something signed, that's a good second option.
Another one from Chuck, who initiates the broker firm compensation agreement? Is this something that we want to bring to listing appointments for sellers to disclose their offered co-op, or have the buyer agent bring an offer? He went to a class that said a listing agent creates it, and another said that it's created at the time of the offer from the buying agent, or it could be either.
It can be either, but the seller is never going to create it. That's only in a situation where you have a seller listing contract that says that you're going to offer cooperative compensation to another broker. Then either you could create it, or the buyer who is submitting an offer can create it and have you sign it. So it could be either or. Our only caveat is make sure that if you're on the buy side and you need that compensation agreement, that you're being smart about how you're getting it signed, so you don't end up in a situation where you can't get it signed.
Thank you. Eric asked a very good question about Alliance's stance on this upcoming renewal period. We're still having a myriad of conversations within our leadership team and listening to all of you. We have not made that decision, so we're not at a place to be announcing that yet, but we know that the dues renewal cycle is fast approaching, so more to follow on that one. And then Steve Beam, who's probably selling a big house in Vail, was late to the call. And yes, sir, this is being recorded. Any other questions as we
Chad, I've got one quick question relating back to advertising of compensation on a listing I'm about to take, and I've discussed a lot of this with my sellers. They asked me about actually putting that co-op on a rider on their sign. Would that be something that is okay to do?
Sign writers are okay. Yeah.
Just don't put a picture of it in the MLS.
Yeah, right.
Anthony Ants, I thought the settlement stated that any brokerage website that gets an IDX feed from the MLS was not allowed to display. Did this change, or was there a misunderstanding?
No, I think that's a misunderstanding. I think it says actually the opposite in terms of you can have these, and even if there is an IDX feed, that's not going to be a violation. So it says just the opposite.
Chad, the other thing I was going to say, some people asked if I'd do another class in Denver. I'm happy to do it. We don't have anything on the books right now, but I can work with your managers to come down, do another class. I don't want to do a million of them, so I'd love to get everybody at the same class if you guys want something. So nothing on the books yet, but we can work something.
A question for those offices that participate in Listings Magic. I do not believe that we can display on other portals or other sites, only RE/MAX Alliance's brokerage site and the sites that you all have powered by Homes in Colorado.
Correct, Chad. No third-party websites.
And yes, everyone loves Jesse, so further classes. All right.
Sorry, can you repeat that? You said you can't put the commission on third-party websites?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Okay, but you said our website.
Colorado, only Homes in Colorado and the sites that are powered by Homes in Colorado, your agent website. They are broker owned websites, and we can on those.
So
Okay.
if we have our own IDX websites, Chad, that's not allowed.
Who is it powered by?
It's Real Geeks,
A third party?
third party. Yep.
You can, if it's your website that you subscribe and you pay and it's chuckgonzalez.com.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Can we advertise the co-op on social media?
There's nothing that has says you can't yet. Social media, brochures, writers, broker websites, these are all fine.
And I think with regards to the website, Santa, you might know more, but I think I saw something that said if it's posted on your website, don't post your website in the MLS. Don't post a link to your website in the MLS. I think it has to be outside of one click, one link, if that's going to be the case. Otherwise, it's considered posting in the MLS. Is that your understanding?
That's correct. And thank you for bringing that up because I think that's a big issue. Don't have those hyperlinks to where you can easily find the commission on your other website.
All right, as we wrap up our call, a couple of thoughts in closing. We are ready, gang. RE/MAX Alliance is ready. We're here to support you. We understand these first couple of weeks are going to be probably the most challenging. We understand that there might be a few missteps, but we've got your back and we're here to support you. I was on a call yesterday with some other team members, and they concluded the call by saying, we want to approach this with a sense of adventure and not a sense of dread. And I know this is hard to do because it is a dramatic change to our industry, but we are ready, we are prepared. Now is the time to perfect your value-based scripting and work with your peers, work with your offices. And more than ever, we have to approach this with a sense of confidence. We have to be confident in how we're explaining it to our clients. We have to be confident in letting our sellers direct what they want us to do. And when you're working with our co-ops, there are brokerage firms and co-op brokers that are completely lost right now. And you showing confidence in this process is going to continue to make RE/MAX Alliance brokers stand above the rest. So that's my closing remarks. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dennis, who makes us all feel so good. And he's going to conclude this with some rah-rah. Dennis, you are up. And thank you all very much. I hope this was helpful. This will be recorded. Any additional questions, please see your managing brokers. We're talking to them all the time. A huge thank you to Jessica, to Jesse, and to Diana for your help with this today. Confident and competent. Thank you, Mark. Dennis, you're up to close our Zoom.
Well, it is such a great day when we can get all of us together, not have technological problems. The Zoom went well. I sort of smiled and I was sitting over here. Y'all know me as a faithful man. I was over here saying, please God, give us one Zoom where we don't have a problem. And this was the one he heard those prayers. So that's great. Folks, we are sitting at a very challenging time, but it doesn't have to be an unfun time for us. A lot of what I heard today is we're walking into ground where we've never been. We're not walking on the moon. We're not discovering gold in Panama. We are not discovering a cure for cancer in a far off land. We are taking care of buyers and sellers. And I think if we focus on the main outcome, which is a successful transaction where we truly served buyers and sellers with a good heart, and don't try to find workarounds to everything. Sometimes go through what they're trying to say and follow the rules and be above board. And let's be the people where people go, man, I want to do business with RE/MAX Alliance because those agents were awesome. There is not a company in the industry that has given more training and hosted more classes, taken more phone calls, and me needed more trazodone than over this. Let me tell you what, trazodone's a sleeping pill if anybody needed to know. But this stuff isn't going to end today. We are going to move forward. We're going to find things will be adjusted. Diana and Jesse will be busy for many, many years. Anytime you change an entire industry as much as we've changed, the lawyers are going to be super busy, and we're going to have a ton of complaints at DORA. We don't have to be first in line at DORA complaints if we're always taking care of our customers. If you have questions, reach out. Make the phone call to us before you think this is right. Call and ask, is this right? It is so much easier in our business to ask than to seek that forgiveness or follow through with a nightmare. You guys are fantastic. We are blessed. We are growing. We are doing good things. I know there is always people who are going to be negative. I have a fun book. You guys should go online and grab it. It's a complaint-free world. Oh my gosh, Stop Complaining and Start Living by Will Bowen. It's a fantastic Amazon read. Let me tell you, it's a little bit thick, but when you stop and look at this business can be fun. We're enjoying it. We love you guys. We are a family. There's not a lot of organizations can say that. We've got great things going on, but this business doesn't have to just stop and then fall apart and we have to reinvent. We're still going. We're still moving forward. So you guys are awesome. We are blessed to have you all. The managers are here to help. The OAs are here to help. The leadership is here to help. We've got Doug Duds, Jesse, got Nick, Diana. Follow our protocols and stuff. If you have questions, please reach out to your manager or OAs. We'll seek the legal counsel for you. Usually we can work through it. But good stuff is coming. You guys are still out there making buyers and sellers happy, and that's what we do every day. We're not giving up on that. The word hope is real. And this, when we give up on hope, we have nothing. So let me tell you what, we have hope in you. We have hope for a better day. We are blessed. We live in the best country in the world. Let's continue to be that light. I put a thing on my Facebook the other day. A broken person is okay. It allows the light to get in. And you know what? I believe that. We're going to break a little bit here, but we're still doing great business. So I can't wait to see you at the closing table. I can't wait to see you doing great things. Reach out. We are here for you. God bless you and enjoy this day. Thank you for being on the Zoom.
Thank you all.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, guys. Sure good seeing y'all.